Hi everyone, welcome to our Brown Bag series. Thank you for signing in early. We will wait for a couple of seconds more for more people to sign in and be settled down. Well, it's Friday today. I hope you've made some plans for the weekend coming up. Speaking of plans, well, we may not know what the future holds, but today's session will help us understand a little bit more about what we can apply, especially during uncertain times. So in view of time, let's begin. Welcome to our Brown Bag series brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with James Cook University. My name's Tammy. Broadcasting live at LLI, we have with us Professor Nigel Marsh from James Cook University, who will be sharing with us on the topic of applying clinical psychology in uncertain times. Before I hand over the time to our speaker, please note that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll also be conducting our feedback poll at the end of the session, so please stay with us throughout. Without further ado, I'll now pass the time to Prof. Nigel. Prof. Nigel, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Tammy. And thank you everyone for taking time to tune in this afternoon for our presentation. As Tammy said, I'm a Professor of Clinical Psychology at James Cook University here in Singapore. Just a brief bit of background, I originally trained in New Zealand and I have worked in hospitals and universities in Malaysia, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Lebanon, and this is my second time in Singapore. I was here for two and a half years working at James Cook University. I went to Malaysia for 7 years and I've now been back for 2 years, and it's good to be back. So that's a little bit of background about myself. For today's talk, we're going to start by talking a bit about psychology, what it is and what it isn't, and because I think that's important, and then about clinical psychology and what it is and what it isn't. And as Tammy's said, the main emphasis in the later part will be how we can use clinical psychology in these really quite difficult times we're living in, sort of fear of the future, uncertainty, etc. So with that background, I'll start with what is psychology. Now, a lot of people have interest in psychology, but there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what it actually is. Psychologists can't read minds. We don't have superpowers. There will never be a Marvel movie about clinical psychologists. But psychology is the study of behavior. And I've got here sort of 3 definitions that build on each other. So it's the study of behavior. It's the study using the scientific method of behavior. And that's very important. I tell people who want to come and train as psychologists that you need to accept that science is a method to obtain the truth. If you don't believe in a scientific method, it's really a bad idea to come and study psychology, because for us, it's a bit like trying to teach a fish how to ride a bicycle. And the basic premise of psychology is the scientific method. And the third sort of expanded definition is it's the study using the scientific method of primarily human behavior, but not just human behavior. I did my master's thesis in an animal welfare laboratory with farm animals, looking at what stresses them and what doesn't. Deer, we had cows, we had sheep. So again, behavior, primarily human, but a lot of psychologists actually do work with animals. And the circus animals, the animals you see performing on TV, the people who've been training them will have a background in operant psychology. So what does it do? It incorporates the study of the brain and behavior. And the brain is important. No brain, no behavior. Basically, it's our central processing unit, to use a computer analogy. And so we need to understand how the brain works, because that's where the behavior comes from. And we're interested in understanding, predicting, and changing human behavior, or simply put, to explain why people do what they do. The understanding, we have a good grasp of that, and predicting, we're reasonably good at that. Changing human behavior is hard. It's hard for people. We don't have magic wands, we don't have magic pills. But the people who come to see clinical psychologists usually want to change their behavior, and our role is to assist them to learn the skills to change their behaviour. Psychology has been around for, I don't know, 140 years, so it's not as old as physics or chemistry, but it's not new either. It started in 1879, is considered the birth date of psychology, and there was a gentleman called Wilhelm Wundt who founded the first psychology laboratory in Germany, and it's sort of moved from there. So that's what it is. It's the study of behaviour. What do people learn? And I think this is important so you understand when you're talking to someone who's got a psychology degree, what they do know and what they don't know. So to become a professional psychologist, to call yourself a psychologist, you actually have to do postgraduate training. But a lot of people do undergraduate degrees in psychology and they don't go on to become professional psychologists. They don't do postgraduate training. But they do get very useful, marketable skills. And this slide and the next one I've put together over the years working in Singapore and Malaysia by talking to employers of our students. You know, why do you hire someone with a degree in psychology versus some other type of degree? And these are the things they mention, that they know how to conduct and evaluate research. You know, and particularly nowadays with the internet, there's so many realities out there. Being able to evaluate research is actually a skill. People talk about doing their own research. It's a bit like me talking about building my own dam. I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to build a dam. So you need skills to be able to evaluate research. Obviously, they have an in-depth understanding of psychology, but the transferable skills that most employers talk about that psychology degrees give and why they employ people with psychology degrees is the problem solving, reasoning ability, and the all important critical thinking. You know, the world is faced with lots of problems. The one thing we know is that we're not going to solve those problems by doing what we currently do, because that's what got us here. So critical thinking and problem solving are the skills for the future. And when I give welcome talks to new undergraduates, and one of the universities I worked in, I was the dean of the faculty, and we used to have science and computing students, biology students, psychology students. And I used to stand there and say, we need you to solve the problems we have. You know, you are the future. This is a serious task. And so that critical thinking and problem solving is very important. So those are general skills. And after people finish their bachelor's degree in psychology, they can go on and get employed. Or as I mentioned, they can do a professional route, so postgraduate professional degree in one of the branches of applied psychology. Or they can go the academic route, so do a research degree and become an academic. I'm not going to talk about the academic route anymore, and I've got one more slide on the employment route, and then we'll move into the professional route. So undergraduate degree in psychology, as I said, that doesn't make people a psychologist, but they do get a wide range of jobs. I've already talked about why people employ them, the skills they look for, but these job titles here are real job titles. These are job titles from our undergraduate students that have finished, didn't go on to do postgraduate, and we track them down sort of 6 months, 8 months later and say, are you employed? Yes. What's your job title? And so you can see there's a wide range. So general psychology skills are applicable across a wide range of settings. But if you want to be a professional psychologist, you go on and do postgraduate training. And there are lots of sort of types of applied psychologists. I've used this slide based on the Australian framework because it's the biggest. The Australians recognise 9 types of psychologists. In the UK, there's 8. North America and Canada recognise about 3 each. And there's a thing called the European Union of Psychologists, and that encompasses about 32 different countries. And I'm going to use their model. They recognise 3, which is educational psychology, clinical psychology, and organisational psychology. And I've been doing this for a very long time now. And I've always given the same advice over the last 30 odd years to people who come to me and say, I want to be a psychologist. What type should I be? And I say, choose one of these 3, organisational, educational, or clinical. Obviously, I chose clinical, but I'm just giving you a brief understanding of what the others are. So an organizational psychology is basically the science of people at work. So organizational psychologists analyze organizations and their people, look at strategies to recruit, motivate, develop, and change organizational behavior. And certainly the recruitment thing is very important in an area that requires a large amount of skill. So what do? They work in organizations, teams, and they also work with individual employees, looking at improving performance, increasing effectiveness and productivity in the workplace. Some people have this idea that basically organizational psychologists work for the employer to get more work out of the employee and sort of work people into the ground. That's not correct, because organizational psychologists know, as good employees know, that a happy employee is a productive employee. So it's about people's well-being by improving their experience at work. And again, they base their practice on science. All of psychology is based on scientific research. It's not opinion. It's not you're born with special knowledge. You basically do the hard graft. Just like most detective work, if you talk to police detectives, there's a lot of hard work goes into solving cases. And so psychology is the same. So that's what organizational psychologists do. And we're talking at the moment, the great resignation phase where people are leaving jobs. COVID, the pandemic, which we'll come to later, did disrupt our universe. It disrupted our whole planet. And one of the consequences that people are talking about is how people are leaving jobs. So organizational psychology is very important in terms of making people happy and productive at work, and it's important for companies. The second type is educational, or what our friends in Canada and the United States call school psychology. So people who are trained as this, they're concerned with development and learning of people throughout their entire lifespan, but they tend to concentrate on the school years. So what do they do at work? They diagnose learning disabilities, disorders such as autism spectrum disorder. They assess developmental learning and behavioural difficulties. And a lot of their work is about designing effective treatment programs so that basically children in the education system can do the best they can do. It's about helping people to achieve the best they can achieve. So those are your two other main types. And now I'm going to talk about clinical psychology for the rest of the presentation today. It's from a clinical perspective. So it's the largest and oldest, and sort of arrived about 1896, so sort of about 17 years after psychology. And it combines knowledge from research on human behaviour and mental processes with efforts at an individual assessment in order to understand and help a particular person. And that's important. So what it does is it takes psychology and applies it to a person in a particular situation. It's not a separate body of knowledge. It's not a separate set of skills. It's the application of what we know about human behaviour to this person in their particular situation. And assessment, diagnosis and treatment of problems and mental illness. How are clinical psychologists different from other people who provide mental health therapy? So they're unique because of the use of science and theory. Evidence-based practice is core. And they use those findings to guide specific interventions for persons who are experiencing adjustment problems and mental disorders. And this is different from psychology in general, where psychologists are interested in general principles, whereas the clinical psychologist takes the knowledge from those general principles and applies it to a specific individual. And there's a biopsychosocial model to understand behaviour. So it's sort of a broad approach of understanding that human behaviour is complex. We are complex beings. And so we need to take the biology, the psychology, and the social environment that people are in into account to help us understand their situation. Just a very brief idea of the history. 1896, the term clinical psychologist in the first psychology clinic was used at the University of Pennsylvania. I mentioned Wilhelm Wundt in Germany before. The person who set up the psychology clinic at the University of Pennsylvania was guy called Dr. Littmer, and he was one of Wundt's PhD students. So he went from the US to Germany, studied with Wundt, came back to the US and set this up. In 1919, the American Psychological Association formed a clinical section, so recognized it as a separate and distinct area of psychology, or more the application of psychology. In 1947, which was a while ago, both in the US and Canada, they set up national standards for training clinical psychologists and sort of set up the whole training framework. Evidence-based practice, the scientist practitioner model was developed and was basically published in or put forward in 1949. So understand this again, this is the model for training. This is what clinical psychologists are supposed to be. The science, the people who practice science. And it spread in 1977, that model was adopted in Australia. There's been evolutions, there's been paradigm shifts. In 2018, we've had a move in clinical psychology to what's called process-based therapy. And as someone who's sort of near the end of my career, I'm very excited by this. I see this as a major change in orientation away from diagnosis and process to sort of just adding, diagnose someone, take a solution out of a folder and give it to them. The process-based therapy is very much about looking at the individual in their situation and understanding them and their circumstances. So in effect, basically fine-tuning interventions for the individual that you're with. And I won't talk any more about that, but I brought it up because it's a major change and the field keeps evolving. The more we learn, the more we understand, we change practices. That's why it's called evidence-based practice. When new evidence comes along, you change your practice. What do we actually do? We provide a psychological formulation of behavior. So not a diagnosis really. That's the medical model of illness. For us, behavior, it's about behavior, and behavior is not a disease, it's behavior. So certainly having a disease, having illness can affect behavior, but to understand behavior is not about taking a medical model or a disease approach to behavior. We work across the lifespan, so from infants to older adults. Also get involved in designing and implementing a wide range of prevention and mental health promotion programs. Prevention is really important, but in some ways it's sort of hard to get it funded because you're asking people to pay you to make sure something doesn't happen. And sometimes from a political point of view, in terms of processes in health and priorities, it becomes difficult to, if I turn up and say, if you give me $1 million, I will stop 250 14-year-olds from starting to smoke cigarettes. Oh, yeah, okay. Or I turn up and say, give me $1 million and I will stop people who are 240 people who are smoking. I will get them to stop. You're more likely to fund me to stop something rather than prevent it, which, so it's difficult. We are located in a wide variety of settings. So private practice, hospitals, universities, general medical centres, community health centres, and mental health services. So you can find clinical psychologists in a wide variety of settings. And one of the areas that's grown a lot in Singapore since I was here last is private practice. A lot of people are working in private practice. We need to distinguish between different types of psychs. And when I was putting this talk together, this was one of the questions someone asked me, how do people know what the different types are? So this is useful, I think, in terms of, there are people who are called counsellors, and sometimes they call themselves psychotherapists. So what do? They listen to clients' personal problems, so problems of everyday living, and they provide advice. Right? So that's what happens when you go to a counsellor. And they have a set role, they deal with a specific range of problems. And there's psychiatrists. Now, most people get psychiatrists and clinical psychologists mixed up, and they're really quite different. And they're different because the model is different. The way in which they approach the problem is different. So psychiatrists have a medical degree. They specialize in treating mental illness, for example, schizophrenia, and they can prescribe medication. And some of them combine medication with some forms of psychotherapy. But they're fundamentally medical doctors who deal with people who have sort of severe mental illnesses, whereas counsellors and psychotherapists are not medical doctors, and they tend to deal with people who have problems of everyday living. Clinical psychologists straddle both areas in terms of client populations or people they work with. So we don't have medical degrees and we cannot prescribe medication. Our treatments are based on changing behaviour without medication. There's a considerable amount of evidence showing that psychological treatments are effective, and hence the whole idea of evidence-based practice. And certainly in areas like in places like the United States, where they pay for services, where basically everyone's under private insurance. Insurance companies want to know that what the provider is doing works. And so hence there's a lot of evidence around to support clinical psychology interventions as being effective. So hopefully, at least that's one important thing you'll learn today, the difference between the different types of psychs and the populations that they work with. Clinical psychologists work with people with problems of everyday living. They also work with people with severe mental illness, but they don't have medical degrees and we don't give medication. And our focus is on about changing behaviour. Okay, so let's come to sort of the application of clinical psychology to these times. And I'm sure some of you are as tired as I am of hearing about the pandemic and hearing the term the new normal, because we don't want it to be normal because it's unpleasant. It is new. And there's this term called an existential crisis, which is probably originally thought up by philosophers. And it refers to the mixture of feelings and questions that we have about the meaning and purpose of our life. So it's a very fundamental thing where people say, what is the purpose of my existence? This is what we call an existential crisis. And these questions aren't easy to find answers to, and they can leave us feeling stuck. Where do I go from here? That type of stuck. And there are lots of things, unfortunately, at the moment that are making people have existential crises. The pandemic I've mentioned, and waiting for the next one. Climate change. Climate change is real. No matter, it's indisputable that human activity is causing climate to change, and not in good ways. And we see people, I've seen people who just are so frustrated. They're not worried for themselves. They're worried for their grandchildren. They love their grandchildren, and they look at the future for their grandchildren, and it's not looking good. So the sort of coal, oil and gas industries are very, very wealthy. So they can funnel large amounts of money to supporting election campaigns by politicians who make decisions about energy. And it's frustrating for people who understand these things to sit there and say, this is happening, this is real, and it's not being changed. Another recent example is Russia's war on Ukraine. It shows how interconnected the whole world is. I mean, there are other wars going on at the moment. So there's wars in Yemen, there's wars in Iraq, there's wars in Syria, but they tend to be more contained. What people have learned from Russia's war on Ukraine is that food and fertilizer prices have gone up all across the world, and they're not going to go down anytime soon. All the politicians and democracies are really worried because cost of living is going up, and no matter how much you explain to people that this is not my fault, they're still going to vote you out because they need to express the fact that they're unhappy with their lives. Energy costs are going up. There's something on Mothership I was reading the other day where people are talking about because electricity costs are going up, they're not using their cars. So they cut back on putting petrol in their cars because electricity costs are going up. And then this brought back something that only people from my generation actually grew up with, the whole idea of nuclear threat. You know, it is possible for people to destroy the planet quite quickly by letting off whole lots of nuclear bombs, and it's called a nuclear winter. So these are difficult times to live in, and none of these issues are fake. None of them are, it doesn't really matter. It matters. Pandemics matter. People die. Climate change matters. Not only are people going to die, but people are going to die of starvation because food will stop. The cost of living going up impacts on people. So these are indeed difficult times. So the problem, and I think Tammy mentioned it at the beginning, you know, about the uncertainty of our future. So it's not unusual to feel stuck or in a rut at various points in our life, but that usually happens with respect to something quite specific, like our career, our social life, relationships, or fitness or sporting achievements. So it tends to be specific. And it's the feeling that you're stuck in a hamster wheel. So, you know, you're running, but you're getting nowhere. You're putting out all this energy and you're just staying in the same place. And not surprisingly, you eventually stop running. But when you are stuck or in a rut for some specific aspect of your life, other aspects of your life continue and eventually pull you out of it. So you're not sure about your career, but your friends are good, your relationships are good, and you're doing well at that sort of netball or basketball or whatever you do. So other things improve and they help you to get out of this particular rut. However, current time is different. And that's one of the problems, I suppose, with talking to clinical psychologists is people don't come and see us because things are going well. And I tell my postgraduate students that when they enter the program. Yeah, there are people out there who have got good lives and are happy. They don't come and see us. They're not the people we see day to day. But what's happened this time is it is quite different. The pandemic has permeated all aspects of our life. And there's no one listening to this who doesn't know that. But what they probably don't realize is that everyone feels like that. The current generations have never experienced anything like this comprehensively disruptive before. World War II was probably the last example, but most people who lived through World War II are in their 80s now. But the current generations, nothing this global has happened in their lifetimes. Now, the thing about humans is we like certainty. We like the idea that we can affect outcomes that are important to us. We're a sort of interesting combination because we have sort of very big brains. The biggest brains on the planet belong to humans. And we like to think of ourselves as logical and rational. And we certainly have the capacity for logic and rationality. Mathematics is basically the philosophy and logic. But we tend to make our decisions on the basis of emotion. So we view ourselves as being logical, but we tend to react on the basis of emotion. And I think a good example of that is some research I was reading recently about how people make decisions. For most people, the most important financial decision that they will make is buying a house. This was some European research, but they found that the average time between viewing the house and deciding to buy it is about 20 minutes. So people take about 20 minutes to decide to buy a house. The average time between thinking, I think I will buy a new car and buying one is about 1 year. Now, the house is a far bigger economic investment, but people tend to make them on the basis of emotional things. And if there's anyone in the audience who works in real estate, you'll know what happens. You know, a couple come in and they walk into the kitchen and they say yes or no. And people can turn around and walk out on the basis of a kitchen. So, but what happens is that despite when things go wrong, despite these getting agitated and unhappy, what tends to happen is we end up with a dominant state of apathy. There's nothing I can do is going to make any difference, so why do anything? Yeah? This applies to recycling, climate change. People say, I can't do anything, so I'm not going to do anything. That doesn't solve the problem for the world or for the individual who's feeling like this. And psychologists refer to this as a learned helplessness. We just end up, in effect, stopping because we learn that we are helpless. We feel that we are helpless. So we need to obviously not do that, because then there's no change, there's no happiness. But getting out of the COVID-19 rut is going to be a process, not an event. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the processes and some of the problems and how we can take some of the material that we've learned from clinical psychology and apply it to some of these problems. And this is the psychology of humans. This is called a triad. It's called the cognitive triad. It's the basis of cognitive behavior therapy that a lot of you may have heard of. Cognitive behavior therapy is the dominant mode of treatment offered by clinical psychologists. Why? Because it has the strongest evidence base, which means that the providers of services, the funders of services, will fund cognitive behavior therapy. They won't fund psychoanalytic therapy. They won't fund psychodynamic therapy because there's no evidence that they work. So, and when I was working in the UK, even the National Health Service had a system whereby they used what they called NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, and the clinical psychologists working in the National Health Service could only offer services that had an evidence base. That's part of their employment contract. So this is the model, and I think it's useful to understand that this is us, right? So we have these things called thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and they interact. It's a cycle. They all influence each other. So what we think, which is we also call our cognitions, affects how we feel and act. And what we feel, our emotions, affects how we think and act. And our behavior, our actions, affect how we think and feel. So, but they're all interconnected. And it's a question of which is the most effective way to intervene. And what I'm going to be talking about more is about the behaviors. So the feelings and emotions, you know, when people find themselves feeling down and negative thinking, negative talk, you know, one of the responses is to basically tell themselves off, to say, pull yourself together. The problem with that approach is it doesn't actually work. And it might work temporarily, it doesn't work long term. So what we tend to do is get people to focus on a change, because that's going to be more effective. That's going to be easy to do. Because as you can see from this diagram, you just need to change one component and the others will change. Yeah? If someone's smiling, they're not going to be thinking my life is horrible because they're smiling. And they're not going to be feeling sad because they're smiling. So, and if people are feeling happy, so that's the emotion, then they will smile. That will result in the behavior. And the feeling happy will also result in them thinking, yeah, today's a good day. I'm glad I'm here. This is good. Okay? So understand this, and we'll work our way through some examples, and we'll come back to this at the end. But you know, if you understand the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists, and you understand this diagram, I feel that you have gained from your attendance today. So, but we'll give some examples, right? So adaptive responses, because we want to focus on behavior. If we can change behavior, we can't actually open your head like a car bonnet and reach into the engine and fix the bits, right? That's not how it works. So we focus on the things we can change. So physical health is an essential first step in maintaining mental health. Everyone knows that. It doesn't mean everyone follows it. Right? There's simple things. Stay active. Eat real food, not too much over processed stuff. It's called junk food for a reason. It is junk. It's not real food. Right? Maintain good sleep habits. Right? Read the information, and people spend lots of time on the internet. So read the information on the effects of reading your phone, blue light, on sleep, and reduce your exposure accordingly. You know, take control, be active, not passive. reading your phone before you go to bed is going to disrupt your sleep, because that's the way your body works. That's what the blue light does when it hits your retina and goes into your brain. So don't read your phone for 30, 40 minutes before you go to bed. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But getting people to do it can be difficult. And don't become reliant on chemical crutches. So alcohol is an obvious example. Sugar is another obvious example. What's on this slide is something that everyone knows, but they don't necessarily do. And so you need to plan so that you do these behaviors and you don't do the bad behaviors. There are apps you can put on your phone which will shut your phone down. I know, anyone under 30 is probably having a panic attack about this time, the whole idea of their phone shutting down at a particular time. That's a good thing. If you want to read something, I know this is very old-fashioned, read a book. It's a thing that's about this big, it's got white paper and black print on it. That will not hyperactive your brain, so you will be able to go to sleep. So physical health is really important. It's hard to feel good about yourself and good about life if your body isn't functioning well. Maintaining mental health is also about prevention. Right? So avoiding things that are going to drag you down. So stay informed, but from reputable sources. Right? Facebook is not a reputable source. Why do we have to tell people that? Yeah, it's a free comedy show, but it's not a source of verifiable information. There is some information on it that is accurate, but you don't know how to find that. And I mean, full confession here, I'm probably the only person in this whole presentation who can say this. I do not have a Facebook account. I will never have a Facebook account. I know that puts me right on the outer, but I'm happy about that. Avoid doom scrolling or doom surfing. And you see people they're on their phones and then they stop. They never stop at anything that's good. I mean, occasionally people stop, there's all those videos out there of happy kittens and people spend hours watching kittens chase their tails. Well, there's nothing wrong with that if it makes you feel good. But avoid spending your time filling your brain with all the things that are going wrong with the world. There are things going wrong with the world. You need to be aware of them. You need to be aware of your role as a human being on the planet. But don't let it fill your life. Right? Accept and recognize that social media can be toxic. That's their business model. If I'm running a social media site, I make my money by selling advertising on my site. How do I get people to come to my site? By putting up stuff that's sensational. Right? When you pick up a comic, you know it's a comic. When you go on social media, remember what it is. This is not the truth. Right? This is someone trying to sell their space to an advertiser, and the best way to do that is to get people like you to spend lots of time reading their site. So understand the business model and limit your exposure. I mean, the cigarette smoking is an excellent example. People now accept that cigarette smoking is not a good thing to do. And so they don't do it. People don't seem to exercise the same degree of maturity and insight with social media. And I've got a little aside down here because it still amazes me, bullying is a serious problem. It's really bad for young kids and children at school. But in the old days, you got bullied on the way to school, at school, and on the way home. Well, once you got home, you were safe. It's not like that anymore. Bullying is 24/7 because of these little computers that we call phones, but they're not actually phones, they're computers. And some parents are aware of this, and it's wonderful, and they take great steps, or they're trying. It's very hard to tell your child not to spend all their time on their phone when they see you doing that, right? So you have to lead by example. But I've worked with parents and I've worked with children who've been bullied. It's just horrible that how sort of pervasive it is. And they are very good at understanding and trying to talk to the children and limiting their access so that they can protect them from what is basically poison coming through their electronic devices. But then they don't exercise the same protection for themselves. It's like someone getting into a car and making sure their child puts on their seatbelt, but they don't put it on themselves. This doesn't make any sense. The poison that comes through that can affect your child is also poison that can affect you. Right? Okay, it won't be bullying, but reading stuff that is wrong or bad or whatever is not a good way to spend your time. So control your access to fiction that's masquerading as fact, or opinion that's masquerading as reality. So media control is important. Work habits. You are not your job. It's very hard it used to be harder to say that than it is now, because people have realized, and I think the work from home has made it difficult to separate work from home and work from play. And that's very true. There's been lots of commentary about this in the media, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean it can't be done. And there are things you have to do to separate them out. And I know people are going back to the office, but some people aren't. Some people have chosen not to. Even if you choose not to, you still have to, in terms of your own health, separate work from home. And there are obvious and simple things people can do. Get dressed for work, even if it's the room next door. And when your work day is finished, change your clothes, just like you used to when you went to the office. Have separate accounts or separate computers. When your work day is finished, clear the desk, take the work papers off. And this is also a good role model for children who, certainly had to do school at home, they're back at school, but getting children to distinguish between school, homework, and play. It's important that people play. We don't come up with good ideas or new innovations from studying. We come up with good ideas and new innovations from thinking. People think when they play. And one of the difficult things about humans is they stop playing. And they say, well, you've got to grow up. No, never stop playing, never stop imagining, never stop thinking. Because this is where good ideas come from. This is where satisfaction comes from. This is where happiness comes from. So there are things you can do, physical. Remember, go back to the diagram. We talked about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Let's do the behaviors. Have a work uniform, clear your desk, have separate accounts, shut the computer down. Have an out of office thing. Turn your out of office thing on every day. And it will say, these are my workouts. So people don't expect you to respond. If you've got a boss who expects you to be working 24/7, they need to be paying you a huge amount of money, or maybe you need to look for another boss. You are not your job. You are more than your job. So, and one of the difficult things, I suppose, that work from home allowed people to do is because the pandemic was just so horrible, it was a horrible way to live. There was a maladaptive response where people just became enmeshed in their work because we'd lost control over all the other things in our lives. We thought, oh, well, at least we can work harder. I can work better. This is not a useful approach. This is not good for you. To pull yourself away from the things that are difficult by embedding yourself in something which basically takes over and defines you. It's not useful. So make and follow the rules to keep the boundary between work and life clearly defined. Do simple things, write the rules out and pin them up. If you're working at home, everyone in the household knows what your rules are. So they can always say, but Mum, you said you were going to finish at 6:30. It's up here on the fridge. You left it up here on the fridge. So set those type of systems up. And an aside again is also about children. Children are not just their schoolwork. One of the things about the pandemic and the sort of school from home is that, you know, parents learned that this is why people go and train for a number of years to be a teacher. It's not natural. It's not a naturally occurring ability. It's difficult. But again, the sort of adaptation of getting children to stop their schoolwork at home. And homework's important. We know academic success is important. And we know this is how your children are going to end up having a higher quality lifestyle than you, is generally through education. But employers and colleagues want people who are rounded. You know, they talk about being a rounded social human being, etc. Just studying more doesn't make someone a better employee, doesn't make someone a better colleague. Right? So, and some companies recognize this now. You know, you take your employees away to various boot camps and that type of thing. You know? When I've been involved with employers sort of doing selections, etc., and also talking to people who didn't get jobs, and they say, you know, but I had a first-class degree. And we say, yeah, but everyone who got an interview had either a first class or a second upper degree. That gets you the interview. It doesn't get you the job. Your performance in the interview gets you the job. And your performance in the interview doesn't come from things you learned in a classroom. It comes from things you learned as being part of the sports team, being part of the debating club, those other skills. So you're not your job. You are more than your job. Social, just getting near the end here. I mean, this is important. We are social beings. I can't emphasize this enough. There is staggeringly clear research out there that says loneliness is a better predictor of when people die than their cardiac health. Now, 10 years ago, this would have been bizarre. So you're saying that if you test someone's heart and say, how healthy are they? Surely that's going to predict when they're going to die. But loneliness kills people. And we found this out during lockdown, during the pandemic, across the world. You know, we've moved to a world where we don't live in villages anymore. Your children aren't next door. Sometimes they're in another country. And we had a whole lot of older adults who weren't that particularly internet savvy. They didn't have connections on the internet. Some of them didn't even have computers at home, and suddenly they had to stay at home. And those people got unwell. They got ill, and it wasn't because of the virus. It wasn't because of lack of food. It was because we're social animals. We are pack animals. We need to be social. Even introverts. And I remember when we had sort of people were restricted. Some introverts that I know were saying, oh, well, as introverts, we're quite happy with this. And I had to point out that, yes, you were, because you're socializing as introverts. So all the introverts were talking to one another and saying, isn't it great we can be introverts? So even introverts need other introverts. Right? So we are our relationship with other people, and not just established relationships, family, friends, work colleagues, but also casual acquaintances. Your favorite noodle soup auntie, or the person on the checkout at our local supermarket. One of the observations, like I said, psychologists, we're observers of behavior, interested in behavior, we observe things. And one of the things I observed during the sort of checking in, check out, remember in the supermarkets, you had those people sitting there and you had to beep the machine. And supermarkets are very busy places. And people would just go and beep, and they would ignore the person, beep, ignore the person, beep, ignore the person. And the person sort of sagged because they were being ignored. And then every so often someone would come up and as the beep would say, hello, and the person would beam. That's a normal response, You see, we use the word social distancing, and I think that was unfortunate. I think the World Health Organization came up with the term because we weren't social distancing. We're not supposed to be. It's physical distancing that reduces the chance of infection spreading. But unfortunately, social distancing got into the common vernacular and the common terms, and that's what people used. But don't socially distance. It's bad for you. It's always bad for you, and it's particularly bad for you now when we are trying to get out of this enormous rut that we're in. And so with the restrictions in clubs, gyms, restaurants, and work from home, many people lost access to their regular social world. You need to get that back. This is not optional. It's as important as oxygen and water. And I think the people who suffered most during having to work from home were young kids from schools and teenagers. Because think back to when you were a teenager. What's the whole point of being a teenager? It's learning how to get on with people that you're not related to. Right? That whole social interaction thing. I know they've got to study hard and they've got to do well at sport, and that's fine. But being a teenager is that process of moving from our family of origin to becoming a person in the world and forming new relationships with other people. Incredibly important skills. And I had a friend whose children were due to start school. I had a number of friends whose children were due to start school, and they didn't. You know, they were supposed to start at the age of 6, and now they're starting at the age of 7.5. Those are important skills that they need to catch up on. So yes, you do need good quality food, not rubbish or junk food. You do need clean air. You do need clean water, but you also need people. You need connections. So what are the basic principles? And I'm just about to wrap up. So these are sort of the basic principles. The first is we've been challenged like never before. Don't deny that. This is not normal. Right? I won't talk about the new normal term anymore because it's still quite frustrating. We're not going to go back to the things the world isn't going to go back to what it was, but it doesn't mean it has to stay like this. So we need to accept that this is a major event. Don't wait until you feel happy to do stuff that makes you happy. Again, it's about doing stuff. Just go and do it. Right? Set a few achievable behavioural goals. You know, I talked before about thoughts, feelings, behaviour. Focus on the behaviour. You need to be the coach of your own behaviour. If you can change your behaviour, your thoughts and your feelings will self-correct. Okay? So this approach is called behavioural activation, and it was one of the treatments for depression. And most people who work in the area have heard of Beck and the cognitive theory of depression, and that was a dominant thing that people are depressed because of what they say to themselves, and that affects how they feel when they get depressed. At the time that this was becoming this sort of dominant field, there was another field, a smaller field, by a character called Lewisham, who said, well, what do we know about people who are depressed? Yes, we know that they think negative things. We know they feel sad, but we also know they don't do stuff. They just don't do stuff. So we can't, like I said, we can't open your head like a car hood and play with it, you know, like a bonnet. People can affect their feelings by taking drugs. That's not useful. It's short term. So let's focus on the behaviour. And Lewisham said, let's just get people doing stuff. And that will cure the depression. And it worked. And it's quite interesting for me, who's been in the game for a long time now, to come back in and to find a new generation of students who are talking about this thing called behavioural activation as a treatment for feeling sad or depression, as if it's new. And I said, no, it's not new. It's just been recycled. But that's a good thing. So the whole point of behavioural activation is focus on your behaviour. Set things up. You know, like I said, the list of when you're going to stop work. State it to your family. These are my rules. If I deviate from these, you can tell me off. You can say, Dad, you said. Mum, what about? Huh? So do the things that you used to enjoy, even if you don't think you're going to enjoy them today, because that's the most adaptive approach. Waking up and thinking, I don't think I'm going to go for a walk because I just don't feel like it today, is not useful. That's letting your feelings dictate what you do. Get up and go for a walk, and then you will feel like it. You will feel good. And if you don't today, you will tomorrow, and you're more likely to go for a walk tomorrow if you went for a walk today. Right? So we're talking about reducing the time spent thinking negative thoughts, and your feelings will self-correct. If you don't think bad things, you won't feel bad. And the best way not to think bad things is to do good things, do positive things. And remember, like I said before about COVID, this is a process, not an event. There is no magic wand, there's no magic pill. It's like training for a new skill, a new sporting event, a new game. You start, you understand the rules, and you apply the rules, and you get better at it. Okay? So this is the takeaway. The psychology of you. I've changed the title, but remember this and understand how you work and how it's all interrelated. And the easiest thing for you to do is to do something about your behavior. Be active, do positive behaviors, and then the thoughts and feelings will take care of themselves. So that's my presentation. I'm going to have a quick look through the Q&A. And in the meantime, my colleague David is going to have a quick talk to you. And I'll come back. Okay, David.
Thank you, Professor Nigel. My name is David. Allow me to have a quick sharing with you more about James Cook University in case you are interested to know more and connect with Professor Nigel. So allow me to share my screen now. Okay, keep the Q&A coming. I will just take me about 5 minutes to present to you about James Cook University and the related clinical course that what Professor Nigel has just mentioned. Okay, sure. Thank you so much for taking time to attend the brown bag today by Professor Nigel. So basically, James Cook University is a public university in Australia and is ranked among the top 300 universities in the world. And we do have a campus in Singapore in case some of you are unaware. So this is some of our recognition for our courses, including psychology, will be recognized by SBS, the Singapore Psychology Society. So this is where our campus located at Sims Drive, and more pictures to come for our facilities and service. Okay, as a university, we do have the full fresh clubs and societies for you to join if you are interested. So there's more pictures, and I will just go to the quick one about psychology. We do have specific psychology facilities available for students that join us for psychology course. So this is a picture of our full-time academics. If you notice, all of them actually have a PhD and located in our Singapore campus. So this is some of our psychology courses. I will not go into details. If you are keen, I will have my contact details uploaded later for you to contact me to find out more. So one quick snapshot about what Professor Nigel has mentioned is about our Master of Clinical Psychology. So this is some pathway that you can relate depending on which stage you are now. You can continue to take up to our Master of Psychology, or some of you might even want to take a PhD if you already have a similar master's. Okay, so just a quick overview. Clinical psychology, you are able to register as a registered psychologist upon completion of the course, as well as the fulfillment of the psychologist requirements. Next is our new course, Master of Psychological Science. This is majoring in business psychology, which will give you the knowledge of what is being mentioned earlier from Professor Nigel as organizational psychology. If this is more familiar to you, because in today's context, more companies and organizations are facing organizational transformation because of the pandemic, the way that they operate and the way that they showcase their product to the world. So this course is for leadership as well as to doing transformation for the company. Okay, so the last part, basically my department are handling will be continuing education, handling all the part-time programs across various fields of study. and including higher degree of research if you are keen to become a researcher. So if any one of you are keen to know more about film school and the course, this will be my contact details. I will put in the QR code and the shortened HTML in the chat box if you are keen to connect with us. And I will hand back now to Professor Nigel to answer the Q&A. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor Nigel.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm going to work my way through them, and we've got a couple of comments in the chats, but I'll work my way through the Q&A. So the first one is from Daryl, just curious, what are your thoughts on hypnotherapy, the Erickson approach? Hypnosis is about suggestion. It's not all powerful. So it's like, I've used hypnosis in the past. I don't use it anymore. I used it as a way of inducing relaxation. So I think that in people who are phobic of particular things, not everyone can be hypnotized. It works for some people and not for others. It depends what you want to do. I mean, I know people who go to hypnosis who want to stop smoking, and so they then go out and light up a cigarette and say, oh, the hypnosis didn't work. That's not how it's supposed to work. So what are my thoughts on hypnotherapy? It's useful for some people in some situations, but not everyone and not all situations. And a good hypnotherapist will look at your level of suggestibility. You have to be suggestible. You can't hypnotize people and get them to do things they don't want to. So you can't actually hypnotize someone and tell them to go and kill your neighbor because you don't like your neighbor, unless that person has tendencies to be a criminal and a murderer anyway. So it needs to work on things. So, you know, when you see people get hypnotized and at a particular sound, they stand up on a table and act like a chicken or something. The people that do that are people who are extroverted and are fun and would do that anyway. But you get someone who's introverted, who's very shy, you can't hypnotize them and get them to do that. So I'll move on now, but it's just that it's good for some people in some situations, but it's not an aspirin. What's the difference in respect of transferable skills between a trained psychologist and a lawyer? This is a great question. And I haven't set this up. I mentioned before about organizational psychologists. And one of the things organizational psychologists do is they look at skills and skill sets of people in different careers. And, you know, so what is a successful engineer? In what ways is a successful engineer different from one who isn't successful, etc., or a pastry chef or whatever? And there's a statistical technique called factor analysis, which allows us to take a whole lot of data points and look for patterns and put things together and say, well, these things load together on this and these things get loaded together on that. When organizational psychologists look at the skill set of the professions and do factor analysis, lawyers and professional psychologists load together on one factor. They load on other factors with other professions, but there's one factor that they share and no other profession shares. Maybe politicians should share it, but basically verbal fluency. So the transferable skill that trained psychologists and lawyers have is the ability to use language. So thank you for that question. It's been a while since anyone's asked that. Okay. What's the distinction and relationship, if any, between organizational behavior and organizational psychology? Would it be correct to say organizational psychology is a subset of organizational behavior or vice versa? Organizational psychology is basically a professional practice. And one of the things they look at is organizational behavior. But there are other people who will consider organizational behavior. So human resource managers, one example. So organizational behavior is basically a focus that a number of people in different professional roles will look at. But organizational psychology is a practice or a framework. So Organisational psychology is not a subset of organisational behaviour or vice versa. They overlap. So organisational psychologists consider organisational behaviour, but other people also consider organisational behaviour. So hopefully that makes sense. And I think it's because, you know, you see books on organisational behaviour. They will be read by organisational psychologists, but also by other people like human resource managers. Okay, thank you. Usually people would say feeling precedes thinking. How do we convince them that feeling is a result of thinking? It's a cycle. So it is a cycle. So how do we convince them that feeling is a result of thinking? You can get them to think about something else and the feeling should stop. Yeah. Distracting people. I mean, good examples are, if you see a child fall in the supermarket or fall on the street, right, and the parents come over, what do? They check and make sure that, you know, it's just a graze. The child has got a sore knee, it's got a grazed knee. But then they distract the child and the child starts to laugh. The knee is still grazed, the skin is still damaged, the pain receptors are still sending pains up to that little child's brain saying, this hurts. So the feeling is still there. And I know you're probably not thinking of this in terms of what you mean by feeling, but that is a feeling. Pain is a feeling. But by distracting the child or getting them to talk about something else, the child stops crying, squealing, or whatever. Right? So yes, I suppose you don't need to get into an argument about what comes first, a sort of chicken and egg argument. But what you need to get people to understand is that these things interact with each other. And if you change one, it will impact the other. Okay. Now, Grace, is neuro-linguistic programming a subset of psychology? Neuro-linguistic programming is a particular sort of approach to helping people deal with problems. It's used by counsellors and psychotherapists and some psychologists. Its background is quite interesting, actually, because what happened is the people who put it together ages ago, and I think the book was called Frogs into Princes, and that's now about 30 years old. What they said was, look, we've got these people out there who are different types of therapists, and they do different types of they do therapy, and then people who go and see them seem to get better. But they come from different theoretical orientations, and they talk differently about what they do and why they do it. So let's go and look for the common things that they do. And they actually went and observed people like, you know, the grandparents of therapy, people like Fritz Perls, who was one of the early rational emotive therapists, you know, and said, okay, let's not listen to what he says about what he's doing. Let's watch what he does. And they looked for commonalities. So neuro-linguistic programming came out of that. Again, it's a bit like hypnotherapy. It's effective for some people, for some things, but it's not aspirin. Okay, so it's a subset of psychology. Yeah, I suppose so. It's more a subset of it's a brand, or it's a type of interventional therapy. So it's not part of psychology as a profession. As a discipline. With reference to the psychology of humans diagram, which of the three is the easiest to change? Yeah, behavior is the most effective one to change. So easy is not a useful way of thinking about it because, like I said, they interact with each other. So I'm more interested in what's the most effective thing to change. If you change behavior, they will, the thoughts and feelings will self-correct and take care of themselves. And the thing about behavior is it's observable, right? It's not something that's happening in here. It's not something that's happening in here. You can get other people involved in changing your behavior. So none of them are easy to change. Behavior change is hard. Everyone knows that. So But what's most effective to change is the behavior, and let the thoughts and feelings self-correct. Oh, thank you, Corinne. I'm pleased you enjoyed the presentation. And this next one is how to help build positive and hardworking mindset in our kids, primary and secondary level. We do have to finish sometime today. So that's a very big question. I think it's important that children feel, and this is obvious, but feel valued. And we need, these are things that our grandparents and our great-grandparents knew, and they knew them and they worked. And they're very simple things like, distinguish between the child's behavior and the value of the child as a human being. So, when a child was doing something wrong, focus on the behavior. Say, rather than say, you are a bad child, because that damages them in terms of how they think you feel about them. Say, this is not the right thing to do. Giving people a sense of agency, whether they are 8 or 80, is important. Giving people some input, as much as their abilities allow, into decisions that affect them, makes them feel that they have some impact on their world. That's important too. This is a very big area, so I'm not going to continue on, otherwise we won't finish. But just those simple things. Give the child some sense of, I am valued, I have some impact, people will listen to me. I mean, one of the most frequent reasons you see, you go out and you see parents with their children, say in a restaurant, and what are the parents doing? They're on their phones. And the children have been given some electronic device as a babysitter. The children who misbehave are the ones who want attention from their parents, usually. Right? Any attention is good attention from a child's point of view. Remember, I said we're social beings. The same happens to children. If you want to destroy a child, ignore the child. That will damage it, right? Damage its growth. So those are the sort of 3 things. Distinguish between the child as a person and their behaviour, particularly when it's bad behaviour. When it's good behaviour, fine. You can pretend that this is you. You're wonderful. You've achieved this. This is great. Give them some sense of being involved in their world, rather than just a passive recipient of things that happen to them. To the extent that you can. And make them know that they're valued. Sorry, that's a very long answer, long question. Okay. Thank you. Where are we? I have a question about how to choose social work environment that could give us positive impact, not otherwise. I'm not sure I understand the question. I think if you're talking about how do we choose a social work environment that gives us a positive impact, we need, there is these cliches: surround yourself with people who think positively. That's true, but they also have to be realistic. Climate change is real. Surrounding yourself with a whole lot of people who say that it's not useful, that's living in a dream world. Just like COVID was real. So I don't know anyone. I know a couple of introverts who said they liked wearing masks, but no one liked wearing masks. Most people didn't. But the reality was we needed to, and we still need to, because that was important. So how do we choose that can give us a positive impact? I'm sorry, I know I'm not answering the question clearly. That's because I'm not quite sure what you mean. I mean, they're basic cliches. Avoid people who are negative all the time. Be with people who are positive in their outlook, but realistic, because we need realism in the world. We can't wander around with our heads in the cloud. I'm sorry, I know that's not an adequate answer, but I don't quite understand the complexity of the question, I think. May I know your thoughts on the field of positive psychology? How is it different from clinical psychology? clinical psychology tended to focus on what was going wrong, and happiness and unhappiness are not separate states. It's a line. It's a line. And so this end we're miserable, this end we're happy. And positive psychology came out of the fact that clinical psychologists realized that being happy wasn't just not having the things that made you sad. Most of us spend our life not happy or sad, sort of somewhere in the middle. Oh, so we're just getting away with it today, And then something happened that makes us feel happy, something happens that makes us feel sad. So positive psychology came from clinical psychology because the understanding that just removing the things that make people unhappy doesn't make them happy. So how is it different? It's an application of clinical principles to understanding happiness, because I suppose one of the things clinical psychology was good at was understanding misery, but then it realized there's another side to the coin or another end to the line. Right? So those are my thoughts on it. Okay. A high school teacher, are there any techniques, self-help ways we can train teenagers to check for onset of depression or preventing depression from settling in? I'm not sort of going to give clinical advice in this type of setting because that would be bad professional practice. Teenagers are different. They are almost a different species. And anyone who's been a teacher knows that. Anyone who's been a parent knows that. The things that make them unhappy can be different from what makes children or adults unhappy. As a principal of a high school, the worst thing that can happen is to have one suicide, because you know there will be more than one. And that's not the case with adults. Are there techniques, self-help ways? There are ways that you could train people to be aware of depression or preventing depression, but prevention is better than cure, I suppose. So having an environment, a school environment where children feel valued, supported, respected, and able to achieve, none of them is going to get depressed. So rather than go and fix depression, take a preventative approach, because we know what makes people sort of unhappy. This is where the positive psychology stuff comes from. It is about understanding what makes people happy. And if you inject those things that make people feel happy and valued and important and in control or having some impact on their life into their environment, then they're not going to get depressed. And so there's nothing to cure, there's nothing to fix. Okay, so that's a quick answer. Here's another one. What's the difference between applied psychology and clinical psychology? Technically, applied psychology is the umbrella term, and clinical psychology is an example of applied psychology. But what you find happens in a lot of journals now is that they use the term applied psychology for organizational psychology. So the application of psychology can be done in a number of ways. Clinical psychology is one of those. Organizational psychology is another one. But as I said, some authors use the term applied psychology to talk about organizational psychology or occupational psychology. Okay, so we need to finish up soon. Okay, oh, good, we're getting near the end. Can self-efficacy be taught? It can be learned. Yes, it can be taught because it can be learned. So yes, that's a short answer. Okay, I think we've done all of those. I will just quickly, okay, I think there was some things in the chat and I need to, no, I think they're gone. I think, oh, they came over, they've been copied over. Okay, I think that we've covered the ones we can. So again, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found some of it useful and certainly educational. I'm going to hand you back to Tammy now. Have a good day and a good life. Goodbye.
Applications. While looking at the number of questions we've received, we trust you've enjoyed today's session. We'll now invite you to participate in our feedback poll. Please give us your honest feedback so that we can further improve on our brown bag series. Feedback poll should be popping up on your screen anytime, so please take a few moments to share with us your observations. Didn't realize the microphone was not on. Anyway, in the next session, please take a few moments to share with us your feedback so that we can further improve on our brown bag series. The feedback poll should be popping up, so please share with us some of these questions. It will only take a few seconds. Thank you so much for your feedback and for joining us today. This brown bag session is proudly brought to you by HeadHunt as well as James Cook University. For our next session on next Friday, 29th of April, we will have the topic of Emerging FinTech Opportunities. Are you ready? By School of Computing and Information Systems, SMU. Please sign up early on our website, masterclass.sg. With that, we will end today's session. Have a wonderful weekend ahead. Bye.